2 teaspoons of laundry powder, that's all it took. A man in Bakersfield, California poured them into a gallon of warm water, watered his tomato plants twice a season, and for 41 years straight. He grew fruit so heavy his stakes bent sideways. His neighbors thought he had a secret seed. He didn't. He had a secret mineral. And it's the same mineral that big fertilizer companies quietly stopped talking about, the moment they started selling you bags of nitrogen instead. But for millions of backyard gardeners, nitrogen isn't the problem. Their soil already has plenty of it. What it's almost always missing is a trace mineral so overlooked that most garden centers don't even stock it. It is called boron, the hidden mineral. And without it, a tomato plant can look healthy, grow tall, and flower, yet still barely give you a handful of fruit. No warning, no fruit, just an empty stem where dinner was supposed to grow. That single detail is the whole mystery of this video. Why do so many healthy-looking tomato plants refuse to set fruit? And why did an old man in California figure out the fix using a $4 box of borax, while modern fertilizer companies never mention it on the label? The answer goes back almost a century, buried in a Dust Bowl science report that most people have never heard of. Stick with me, because once you understand what boron actually does inside a tomato plant, you'll never look at a droopy, fruitless tomato vine the same way again. Let's start with the man who made this trick famous, at least among old-timers who still swap gardening secrets over a fence instead of a phone screen. His name was Earl Whitaker, and he farmed a quarter-acre outside Bakersfield for over 4 decades. Neighbors called his tomatoes Earl's Monsters, because by midsummer his plants would be so loaded with fruit that he had to prop up the branches with scrap lumber just to keep them from snapping. People assumed he had some rare heirloom variety, some secret seed passed down in his family. But Earl grew the same plain, ordinary tomato varieties everyone else in the valley grew. Same seed packets from the same hardware store. The difference wasn't in the seed, it was in what he fed the soil. Earl's routine was almost embarrassingly simple. Twice a season, he dissolved 2 level teaspoons of plain borax, the kind sold in the laundry aisle for cleaning clothes, into 1 gallon of warm water. He'd apply it once when the first flowers opened on the plant, and again a few weeks later, right when the young fruit had swelled to about the size of a golf ball. That was it. No complicated schedule, no expensive additives. Just a pinch of a mineral most people only associate with scrubbing bathtubs. And it worked season after season for 41 years. That's not luck. That's not a fluke of weather or soil in one particular backyard. That's biology repeating itself over and over, in a way that Earl understood long before most modern gardeners ever heard the word boron. So where did this trick actually come from? It didn't start with Earl. He learned it from an Oklahoma County extension agent back during the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, a time when American farmers were desperate for anything that could coax food out of soil that had been beaten down by drought, wind, and years of relentless farming. In 1934, agricultural researchers working in the hardest-hit counties started noticing something odd. Certain fields, even ones that looked properly fertilized with nitrogen and potassium, were producing crops that flowered beautifully but failed to set fruit or seed properly. It was as if the plants were trying to reproduce and simply couldn't finish the job. Extension agents began testing different trace minerals to figure out what was missing, and boron kept showing up as the answer. Fields treated with tiny amounts of borax-based compounds suddenly produced far more fruit and seed than untreated fields nearby, even though both fields had identical amounts of the standard fertilizers. Word spread slowly, farmer to farmer, exactly the way Earl eventually heard about it years later. Then in 1939, the United States Department of Agriculture backed up what those Dust Bowl farmers had already discovered. USDA researchers published findings confirming that boron played a critical, almost irreplaceable role in how flowering plants set fruit. It wasn't a minor nutrient. It was one of the most important trace elements for pollination and fruit development, especially in crops like tomatoes. For a while, this research actually shaped mainstream farming advice. Boron deficiency was treated as a real documented problem. and small doses of borax were a known, accepted remedy. So what happened? Why did this well-documented science quietly vanish from gardening advice by the 1960s? The honest answer isn't some dramatic conspiracy meeting in a boardroom. It's simpler and, in some ways, more frustrating. As commercial fertilizer companies scaled up after World War II, their entire business model shifted toward selling large, standardized bags of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the big three nutrients printed on every bag as NPK. Trace minerals like boron are needed in such tiny quantities, sometimes just a few teaspoons per season for an entire garden, that there was no real profit angle in packaging and marketing them. A homeowner buying a $4 box of laundry borax that lasts for years isn't exactly a repeat customer for a fertilizer company. Meanwhile, a bag of concentrated NPK fertilizer that needs to be reapplied every few weeks, that's a business. Over time, gardening advice simply followed the money. Extension pamphlets, magazine columns, and eventually gardening websites all leaned harder and harder into promoting nitrogen-heavy feeding schedules because that's what the industry was actively pushing. The old boron research from the 1930s and 1939 didn't get disproven. It just got buried under decades of marketing that had nothing to do with what tomato plants actually needed most. Now here's where things get genuinely fascinating, because once you understand what boron does inside a tomato plant at a biological level, this whole mystery stops feeling like folklore and starts feeling like straightforward, provable chemistry. Think about what a tomato flower actually has to accomplish. Pollen has to travel from the male part of the flower down through a microscopic tube to reach the female part, where fertilization happens. That tube, called the pollen-tube, has to physically grow and extend through living tissue in order to deliver its cargo. This isn't a passive process. It requires the plant to actively build new cell walls at a rapid pace, elongating that tube cell by cell until it reaches its target. Boron is essential for that construction process. Without enough boron, the pollen tube grows weakly, stalls out, or fails altogether. And as a result, fertilization never completes. The flower senses that reproduction failed, and instead of wasting energy on a fruit that has no future, the plant simply drops the flower. That's the empty stem you see when a healthy-looking plant produces almost no tomatoes. It's not disease, it's not bad luck, it's a boron-starved flower quietly giving up. But boron's job doesn't end at pollination. Once fertilization does succeed and a tiny fruit starts to form, boron takes on a second critical role. It helps cross-link pectin molecules inside the plant's cell walls. Pectin is the structural glue that holds plant cell walls together, and as a tomato swells with juice and sugar, its cell walls have to stretch and expand without falling apart. Boron acts almost like a molecular staple, linking pectin strands together so the cell walls stay strong and flexible at the same time. This is a big part of why boron-treated tomatoes tend to grow larger without cracking or splitting, especially after a heavy rain following a dry spell, which is one of the most common ways tomatoes fail late in the season. And there's a third role, one that directly affects how the tomato actually tastes. Boron helps move sugars produced in the plant's leaves through the transport system and into the developing fruit. This process is called sugar translocation, and it's essentially how a tomato gets sweeter and more flavorful as it ripens. A boron-deficient plant may still produce fruit, but that fruit often ends up blander because the sugar highway from leaf to fruit isn't running efficiently. This is why some old-timers, Earl included, insisted that boron-treated tomatoes just taste different, richer, sweeter, more like something a person's grandmother used to grow before store-bought produce flattened everyone's expectations of what a tomato should taste like. So pollen tube growth, fruit cell wall strength, and sugar delivery. 3 separate biological processes, all dependent on one trace mineral that most modern gardeners have never once added to their soil. Which raises the next obvious question. If boron matters this much, why is it missing from so much American garden soil in the first place? The answer traces back millions of years to where the tomato actually came from. Wild tomatoes originated in the highlands of the Andes Mountains in South America, in volcanic soil that is naturally rich in trace minerals, boron very much included. Volcanic activity constantly replenishes minerals in that soil, creating an environment where boron levels stay relatively high generation after generation. Tomato plants evolved for thousands of years in that mineral-rich environment, which means their biology essentially expects a steady supply of boron to function properly. American garden soil is a completely different story. Most of it has been farmed, tilled, rained on, and leached of trace minerals for well over a century. Boron is water-soluble, which means it washes out of soil relatively easily with heavy rain or irrigation, especially in sandy or loamy soils that don't hold on to minerals well. On top of that, a huge number of American gardeners regularly apply lime to their soil to raise its pH, which is generally good advice for many crops, but it has a side effect. Higher soil pH actually reduces how available boron is for plant roots to absorb, even when some boron is technically still present in the soil, so you end up with a frustrating combination. Boron washes out over time, and the common fix for acidic soil actually locks up whatever boron remains. The result is that a huge percentage of home gardens across the country are quietly running on borderline or outright deficient boron levels, without a single visible warning sign until flowering season arrives and the fruit simply refuses to show up. This is exactly the gap Earl Whitaker's method fills, and it's worth walking through the protocol precisely, because getting the details right actually matters here. The base solution is 2 level teaspoons of plain borax dissolved completely into 1 gallon of warm water. The word plain is doing a lot of work in that sentence. This means old-fashioned laundry borax, sodium tetraborate, with no added detergents, no fragrance boosters, no bleach alternatives, and no blended cleaning agents. Many modern laundry aisles now stock borax substitute products, or detergent boosters that contain borax mixed with other chemicals, and those are not what you want anywhere near your vegetable garden. You're looking for the simple, single-ingredient version, which is still sold in most grocery stores, specifically in the laundry aisle, usually in a plain box. Warm water matters too, because it helps the borax dissolve completely and evenly. If you leave undissolved granules floating in the mixture, you risk applying an uneven, overly concentrated dose directly onto a small patch of soil, which can actually harm the plant rather than help it. Sakoin. Boron is one of those minerals where the line between beneficial and toxic is narrower than most trace elements, so precision here isn't optional. Stir the solution until it's completely clear, with no granules settled at the bottom of your container. Timing is the other piece that Earl was strict about, and for good biological reason. The first application goes on right when the plant sets its first flowers, the very beginning of the flowering stage. This is exactly the moment when pollen tube growth is about to become critical, so the plant has boron available right when it needs it most for successful fertilization. The second application comes later, once the fruit that did successfully form has swelled to roughly the size of a golf ball. This timing lines up with the stage when cell wall development and sugar transport into the fruit are both ramping up, which is when that pectin cross-linking and sugar translocation really matter. 2 applications per season, spaced weeks apart, applied as a soil drench around the base of the plant rather than sprayed directly onto leaves. That's the entire method. No complicated schedule, no daily monitoring, no expensive soil test kits required. Although if you want to confirm your own soil's boron levels before starting, a basic soil test can absolutely tell you that in advance. It's worth pausing here to say plainly that more is not better with this particular mineral. Boron toxicity is a real thing, and it happens at concentrations not drastically higher than the beneficial dose. This is precisely why Earl's measurement was so exact: 2 level teaspoons, not heaping, and always fully dissolved in a full gallon of water, never applied as a concentrated paste or powder directly to soil. Respecting that precise ratio is what separates a season of heavy, healthy fruit from a season of stressed, damaged plants. If you've been nodding along thinking this sounds almost too simple to have been forgotten for 60 years, you're right to notice that. And if this kind of buried, old-fashioned know-how is the sort of thing you want more of, this channel exists specifically to dig these methods back up, so subscribing means you won't miss the next one. What makes this whole story land so hard is the contrast at its center. A massive, well-funded fertilizer industry spent decades pushing bigger bags of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, while the actual bottleneck for millions of home tomato growers was sitting quietly in a $4 box in the laundry aisle the entire time. Not because the science was wrong, not because Earl Whitaker was some kind of secret genius nobody else could replicate, simply because a trace mineral that only needs to be applied twice a season in teaspoon-sized amounts was never going to be a profitable product to build a marketing campaign around. One more detail is worth knowing before you try this yourself, because soil isn't identical from one backyard to the next. Sandy soil drains fast and tends to lose boron even quicker than clay-heavy soil, so gardeners working with light, sandy beds may notice a bigger jump in fruit production than someone with dense clay soil that naturally holds on to minerals a little longer. Container gardening tells a similar story. Potting mix is usually made from ingredients that start out almost completely stripped of trace minerals, which means container-grown tomatoes are often even more boron-starved than anything planted directly in the ground. If you've ever grown a beautiful, bushy tomato plant in a pot that flowered for weeks and gave you almost nothing to show for it, boron deficiency is one of the first things worth ruling out. And if your soil already runs on the alkaline side, remember that raised pH locks up boron even further, which means gardeners who've limed their beds in past seasons may actually need this treatment more, not less, even though conventional advice would tell you the opposite. It's also worth noting what this method is not. It's not a substitute for nitrogen, potassium, or the other major nutrients a tomato plant genuinely needs to grow strong stems and healthy leaves. Boron doesn't replace balanced feeding. It fills a specific, narrow gap that balanced feeding usually misses entirely, because most commercial fertilizers were never formulated with this trace mineral in mind to begin with. Think of it less like a replacement and more like the missing piece that lets everything else you're already doing actually pay off in fruit instead of just foliage. Earl didn't need a marketing campaign. He needed a gallon jug, 2 teaspoons of borax, and 41 years of quietly proving that sometimes the biggest yield gains come from the smallest, most overlooked ingredient sitting on a store shelf the whole time, waiting for someone to remember what it was actually for. It's time to bring that same success to your own garden. Let's get started.